HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents Uneasy Peace, The Great Crime Decline, the Renewal of City Life, and the Next War on Violence. By Patrick Sharkey. Read by P.J. Ochlan. Preface. On October 12, 1977, television viewers across the nation were given a glimpse of life in the South Bronx. Game 2 of the 1977 World Series was being broadcast from Yankee Stadium, where the New York Yankees hosted the Los Angeles Dodgers. When Yankees second baseman Willie Randolph stepped to the plate to lead off the bottom of the first inning, the camera cut to an aerial view of the streets surrounding the stadium and focused the attention of the viewing audience on an enormous blaze that appeared to be consuming an entire block of the city. Legend has it that Howard Cosell, the sportscaster with the iconic halting voice, described the scene to viewers in his matter-of-fact manner. "Ladies and gentlemen, the Bronx is burning." The truth is, he never uttered those words. Cosell's broadcast partner, Keith Jackson, was the one who first spoke when the camera showed the images of the scene less than a mile from the stadium. That is a live picture. Obviously a major fire in a large building in the South Bronx region of New York City. The flames shot high in the air, illuminating a full block in a section of the city that otherwise appeared to be pitch black, lifeless. Jackson, whose own voice had the natural urgency of a live-on-the-scene reporter, was audibly stunned. "My goodness, that's a huge blaze." The broadcast returned to the scene 5 times over the course of the game. Each time, Jackson and Cosell marveled at the sight of the fire, providing updates on the effort to control it and assurances that no one had died. More than 2 hours into the game, in the bottom of the 6th inning, the last report showed that the blaze had finally been extinguished. The fire that broke out during Game 2 stunned the nation. But the sight of burning buildings was not unusual in the South Bronx. During a period in which New York City was shedding jobs and people, the value of real estate in the Bronx plummeted, and landowners were desperate to extract some value from their property. Dozens of neighborhoods across the Bronx lost more than half of their real estate to arson, and the community began to look as if it were the target of an aerial bombing campaign. The spectacle of a burning city may have evoked fascination and terror among viewers, but the nationally televised fire was just one relatively minor episode in a year of chaos, violence, and destruction in the South Bronx. In the 1970s, this devastated section of New York City had morphed from a traditional poor urban ghetto into a national symbol of urban blight, violence, disorder, and lawlessness. The Bronx was the place where the serial killer David Berkowitz, who called himself Son of Sam, roamed the streets for months, picking out victims at random and sending notes to newspaper columnists daring the police to find him. Berkowitz killed 3 of his victims in the Bronx during that summer of 1977, and several more in Queens, stoking the fears of New Yorkers as the tabloids battled to document the most sensational details of his murders and his life. It was a place where the lights could go out in midsummer, as they did on July 13, 1977, when the city's electrical grid failed and anarchy ensued. Shopping districts in Brooklyn, Queens, and the Bronx were set afire and looted overnight. Television stations went dead, and the city exploded. By the time the power went back on, thousands of stores were destroyed, and almost 4,000 people had been arrested. The South Bronx came to be seen as a national disaster, the most notorious section of a city that had reached the brink of bankruptcy in 1976. Less than a week before the World Series began, the New York Times ran a front-page photograph showing President Jimmy Carter and several advisors touring a barren stretch of Charlotte Street, just east of Yankee Stadium. Carter and his aides looked as if they had stumbled upon a post-apocalyptic ghost town, a desolate landscape littered with piles of rubble, beer bottles, scattered newspapers, and dirt. A week later, when the fire broke out in the first inning of Game 2, Howard Cosell noted the irony. "That's the very area where President Carter trod just a few days ago." In 1977, the South Bronx became the most visible example of the failed American city. The neighborhood would become the setting for novels and films dramatizing the dystopia of post-industrial urban life, and the dominant feature of the new urban landscape was violence. Spike Lee captured the chaos of 1977 in his film Summer of Sam. The Warriors, which told the story of a street gang fighting to escape the Bronx and return to their home in Coney Island, became a cult favorite. Fort Apache: The Bronx was released in 1981, starring Paul Newman as a cop struggling amid rioting and murder in the South Bronx. And in The Bonfire of the Vanities, Tom Wolfe depicted public spaces like Franz Siegel Park, just a couple of blocks south of Yankee Stadium, as places of lethal danger. Nobody from the district attorney's office went out into the park on a sunny day in May to have lunch. Not even a court officer, who had a uniform and legally carried a .38, ever did such a thing. Politicians used the South Bronx to weave their own tales of urban despair, dysfunction, and danger. Presidential candidate Ronald Reagan returned to Charlotte Street 3 years after President Carter's visit and blamed the incumbent for failing to create any visible change in the Bronx. Jesse Jackson, a Democratic hopeful in 1984, called attention to the plight of the urban poor by spending a night in the Forest Houses, a public housing development very close to the block that burned in front of a national audience of baseball fans. The horror of the South Bronx was sensationalized and exploited, used as a prop by filmmakers and novelists and politicians to capture the nightmare of urban America. But the reality was equally terrifying. The descent started with abandonment, destitution, joblessness, and hopelessness that were symbolized by the 12,000 or so fires that were set in the South Bronx over the course of the 1970s. But over time, the epidemic of arson turned into a plague of violence. Crime had been rising steadily in New York and across the country, but the market for crack cocaine ushered in an era of unprecedented violence. The sociologist Randall Contreras, who grew up in the community in the late 1980s, recalls the drug dealers who ruled the streets. "I could not miss them," he writes. "They drove expensive cars, with shiny rims, with the sunroof open, or with the convertible top down, for all to see." Dealers filled in the abandoned spaces created by years of arson, and open lots and vacant buildings became the sites for a booming business that was regulated by force. Guns were drawn, people were shot, sidewalks were bloody, and children were hurt. Dead bodies surfaced everywhere. Violence ruled the streets. There was no more public space. At the start of the 1960s, fewer than 500 people were murdered annually in New York City, but by 1980, more than 1,800 homicides took place each year. A decade later, the level of violence worsened. More than 2,000 people were murdered in each of the first few years of the 1990s. In the years after a national audience watched the Bronx burn, Yankee Stadium was known as one of the country's most dangerous ballparks. To make their way to the stadium, fans had to venture into a subway system with graffiti so thick that signage within the tunnels was often impossible to see. Epidemics of smashed windows on subway cars broke out periodically, and service was unreliable as the cars broke down regularly. In 1982, the chairman of the Metropolitan Transit Authority revealed that he did not allow his own teenage children to ride the subway at night, and that even he was nervous when he entered the subway. New Yorkers were nervous as well. Ridership and revenue plummeted to historic low points. The Yankees owners, who had long sought to move the team away from the South Bronx, openly complained about the community surrounding the stadium. In 1994, Richard Kraft, the Yankees' vice president of community relations, was quoted in New York Magazine referring to the kids who played basketball at McCombs Dam Park, across the street from the stadium, as monkeys who crack the rim and bend the hoops. He would later resign for his comment, but the animosity between the organization and the community remained. As the Yankees looked for an opportunity to escape the Bronx, warnings from the team alerted fans to the perception of crime in the area, essentially telling them to come to Yankee Stadium at your peril. And fans heeded the advice. During a period in which thousands of people were being murdered in New York City, attendance at Yankee Stadium was dismal. Part of the reason for the small crowds was the performance of the team, but even when the Yankees were competing for a playoff spot, about half of the seats were empty for every home game. In some years, night games drew 10,000 fewer fans than day games, as few New Yorkers were willing to make their way out to the Bronx after the sun went down. From the subway system to the street corners to the public parks to the hallowed ground of Yankee Stadium, the South Bronx had become a place that was feared and avoided. Spaces that had been created to support public life, to be enjoyed by all, those that define city life in America's greatest metropolis, were dominated by the threat of violence. In September 2014, a few months after I began writing this book, I was asked to present a report to a room full of probation officers, data analysts, and program administrators in the Bronx District Attorney's Office. The meeting took place less than a block from the municipal building that Tom Wolfe described in The Bonfire of the Vanities, overlooking Franz Siegel Park. As is often the case when academics present their research to people working on the ground, the meeting was tense. I had been asked to evaluate a unique program designed to engage violent offenders as they returned from prison, and the results of the evaluation suggested the program may not have been as effective as those in the room had hoped. I was the bearer of bad, or at least mixed, news, and my inconclusive results didn't sit well with the people who spent their time working with those who are leaving prison. By the time the meeting ended, I needed to sit down. On my way back to the subway, I decided to walk through Franz Siegel Park. It was a place with benches and shade, and I was curious to see whether it resembled the description in Wolfe's classic novel, whether it still felt too dangerous to sit down on a park bench and eat lunch. It was late afternoon on a hot, sticky day. The park has some remnants of 1970s New York, like the crumbling old concrete seating area that looks like it should have been torn down decades ago. But it also has beautiful stone walls that wrap around its edge, and rocky hills perfect for children to climb. Leafy trees separate the park from the street. A man and woman were talking quietly on a bench, kids played as their mother looked on, and a group of dogs ran off-leash as their owners chatted nearby. Some aging men who looked down on their luck sat talking in the shade, and a few others sat silently on their own. In a worn basketball court at the south end of the park, 2 young boys shot hoops lazily. I walked back up on the west side and sat for a few minutes on a wooden bench. Fellow New Yorkers strolled by slowly, taking advantage of the quiet and shade. Poverty was still visible inside the park and out, but there was not a hint of violence in the air. 25 years earlier, Franz Siegel Park was a place most New Yorkers were not willing to enter. But on this day in September 2014, it felt like an urban sanctuary. In 2014, the year I began to write this book, the calm of Franz Siegel Park reflected the atmosphere of peace throughout New York City. In the city where more than 2,000 people used to be murdered each year, 328 people were killed in 2014. The lowest tally since the first half of the 20th century. And it wasn't just New York that had been transformed. Violent crime fell in almost every American city from the early 1990s to the early 2010s, and it plummeted in many major urban centers. In Atlanta, Dallas, Los Angeles, and Washington, the murder rate fell by 60 to 80%, similar to the crime drop in New York City. Even in places that continued to have high levels of violence, like Oakland and Philadelphia, the homicide rate fell by at least 33%. To write this book, I spent 3 years gathering data and investigating how the decline in violence had altered American cities and the lives of their residents. And with each analysis, I became more convinced that the drop in violent crime had led to a fundamental change in the nature of U.S. urban life. As violence fell, cities came back to life in ways that were both obvious and subtle. Families returned from the suburbs and moved into central cities, and the poorest urban neighborhoods began to attract newcomers. Schools became dramatically safer than they were 20 years ago, and test scores rose the most in the places that became safest. As academic performance improved and employment opportunities returned to urban neighborhoods, children from families near the bottom of the income distribution became more likely to move upward, out of poverty. Most important, thousands of young people were no longer being gunned down and taken from their friends and families. The drop in homicides since the early 1990s led to an improvement in the life expectancy of black men that rivals any public health breakthrough of the last several decades. As all this was happening, the feel of city life changed. Public spaces like Franz Siegel Park became peaceful and quiet, once again seen as welcoming to the residents of neighborhoods like the South Bronx. Subway cars, commuter lines, and buses in U.S. cities filled up, as residents and commuters became more willing to leave their cars behind and travel to and from work together. Public libraries began to brim with activity in the cities where crime fell, as parents no longer had to shield their children from the world outside the front door. Fans came back to Yankee Stadium in the Bronx, and just as many began to show up for night games as for day games. Cities, where public life is prioritized over private life, where property is used collectively and interaction is constant and unavoidable, came back to life as crime declined. The moment of peace I experienced on the park bench was shared across most of urban America. The year 2014 was the safest on record in New York, and one of the safest in U.S. history. The decline in American violence is a stunning development that no one predicted, and that many people still do not believe. The evidence I present in this book suggests it has been one of the most important social trends to hit cities over the past several decades. It is a victory for urban America. But it is a tainted victory. And it is an uneasy peace. As I sat in Franz Siegel Park, I didn't realize how fragile the moment was, but I probably should have. A few months earlier, in July 2014, 43-year-old Eric Garner, a black man, was killed while being arrested for selling loose cigarettes on the street in Staten Island. A bystander recorded the incident, and the video is chilling. It shows Garner arguing with officers for several minutes and refusing to be handcuffed. An officer then wraps his forearm around Garner's throat, forcing him to the pavement, and attempts to hold him still with his arms locked around Garner's neck. Garner is shown gasping for air after being restrained, subdued, and handcuffed, and repeatedly pleading, "I can't breathe." And finally, the video shows Eric Garner lying motionless on the sidewalk for several minutes as bystanders, emergency care workers, and police look on before being rolled onto a stretcher and taken away in an ambulance. Garner was declared dead an hour later at a local hospital. The official cause of death was listed as compression of the neck and chest. But after watching the video of Garner's arrest, it is easy to see why many New Yorkers came to a simpler conclusion. He was choked to death. What happened to Eric Garner has happened to others all across the country, and it has happened for a long time. Later in the same year, John Crawford was shot dead in an Ohio Walmart while carrying a BB gun from the store's shelves. 4 days later, Michael Brown was shot and killed in Ferguson, Missouri. While the nation watched Ferguson erupt in protest, Ezell Ford, a mentally ill black man, was shot dead when he was stopped by 2 officers in Los Angeles. A few months later in Cleveland, 12-year-old Tamir Rice was shot and killed while playing with a toy gun in a public park. In April 2015, Walter Scott was shot in the back while running away from an officer, unarmed, after a traffic stop in Charleston, South Carolina. And 8 days later, in Baltimore, Freddie Gray was arrested for possessing an illegal knife and placed in the back of a police van, which made multiple unexplained stops on the way to central booking. By the time the van arrived, Freddie Gray was unconscious. He was dead a week later with spinal cord injuries. These deaths are not independent, isolated incidents. They are only the most visible examples of a national approach to confronting violent crime and the larger problem of urban poverty in the nation's poorest, most segregated neighborhoods. This approach began at the tail end of the 1960s, when the United States abandoned its efforts to confront urban poverty with a campaign focusing on justice and investment, and settled on an alternative strategy that relied heavily on the police and the prison. Since then, police departments nationwide have been bolstered by growing federal and state funding and emboldened by a policy of aggressive, zero-tolerance policing that targeted low-income communities of color. The rise of intensive policing was accompanied by increasingly punitive criminal justice policies and more aggressive prosecution of offenders, leading to historically and internationally unprecedented levels of incarceration. An honest assessment of the best evidence we have suggests that these changes in criminal justice and policing have contributed, at least partially, to the decline in violent crime. But our national reliance on aggressive policing and mass incarceration has taken a heavy toll. As the criminal justice system has expanded its reach, the scale of imprisonment has torn families apart and destabilized entire communities. At the same time, as videos of abusive or lethal police behavior have proliferated and gone viral, the policing tactics that have long been familiar in the country's most disadvantaged neighborhoods have become visible to the rest of the nation. The outrage that followed Eric Garner's death, the widespread protests against police brutality, the emergence of the Black Lives Matter movement, and the unrest that erupted in Ferguson, Baltimore, Dallas, Charlotte, Milwaukee, and elsewhere are clear signals that the methods our nation has used to confront urban violence are no longer acceptable to much of the American public. As the movement for criminal justice and policing reform has gathered momentum, we have seen ominous reminders of what the old era of urban violence looked like. When the protests on the streets of Baltimore and St. Louis subsided and faded from media view, those same streets were hit by a wave of violence. After reaching a historic low in 2014, the national homicide rate rose by 11% in 2015, then rose again in 2016. The spike in homicides may represent little more than a short-term deviation from the long-term trend of falling violence. But there is fear in places like Baltimore and Chicago that the gradual decline in violent crime over the past 2 decades may have been wiped away after 2 years of unrest and killings. That same fear is now felt in Cleveland, Houston, Milwaukee, and St. Louis, where the sudden rise of violence may be an ominous sign of a new era. The decline in violence that changed urban America is fragile. It is threatened by the resentment of police officers who have been asked for the past 20 years to take over dangerous city streets by any means necessary, and who are now being vilified in some quarters and told to change the way they do their jobs. It is threatened by the outrage of the many Americans who are now aware of the scale of mass incarceration, and the protesters who have now seen how police officers have long treated residents in the nation's poorest, most segregated neighborhoods. It is threatened by the election of Donald Trump, whose law and order rhetoric is a reminder of the language Richard Nixon used back in 1968, just before the last century's sharpest rise in violence occurred. And lastly, it is threatened by a broader, more troubling trend that has been developing for the past 40 years: the rise of urban inequality. As economic inequality has grown steadily since the 1970s, our cities have become increasingly segregated by income. Poverty has become more concentrated in neighborhoods that are detached from the rest of the city. The wealthy have moved into distinct areas of their own, and gated communities have proliferated. The new American city is historically safe, but shockingly unequal. The developments that have taken place since I sat on the park bench in September 2014 have presented mayors, state and federal legislators, police departments, community leaders, and advocates with a set of challenges that I consider crucial to the future of American cities. First, how can we preserve and extend that moment of peace so that it is felt in every city and every neighborhood across the country? Second, how can we do so with a new approach, one that reduces violence, but also confronts the larger problem of urban inequality? Part 1. The New American City. 1. The end of the era of violence. The early 1960s are not remembered as a peaceful time in American history. President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in 1963, the same year that brutal images of police dogs attacking civil rights protesters in Alabama were broadcast to the nation. Casualties in Vietnam were just beginning to rise. 1 year later, in 1964, riots broke out in Harlem and Philadelphia, a preview of the unrest that would spread to hundreds of American cities in the years to come. But in the 50 years that followed, the homicide rate in the United States would never fall as low as it was in those early years of the 1960s. In both 1962 and 1963, there were only 4.6 homicides for every 100,000 people in the United States, according to data from the FBI. This period of domestic peace did not last. The national homicide rate rose steadily and quickly in the latter half of the 1960s, more than doubling between 1963 and 1974. From the mid-1970s through the early 1990s, the homicide rate fluctuated between roughly 8 and 10 murders per 100,000 residents, reaching a peak that was at least as high as any previous point in the 20th century. And it wasn't just the level of extreme violent crime that had changed. The character of violence had changed as well. Young people recruited into the crack trade were shooting and killing each other at rates that were unfathomable to other Americans. The rate of juvenile homicides almost doubled from 1985 to 1993. As the perpetrators of homicides became younger, the use of firearms became more prevalent, and the rise in lethal violent crime came to be seen as a problem most closely linked with one particular demographic group: young black men. It was in this context that John DiIulio, a political scientist writing from Princeton, rose to prominence as the country's most influential expert on crime. DiIulio talked with criminals and law enforcement officials and tried to make sense of the wave of violent crime that had hit America's central cities. He diagnosed the problem of violence as a moral crisis and pointed to a new form of impulsive, remorseless youth criminal as responsible. DiIulio described this new breed of
Sample complete. Ready to continue?